Jill here with siriustalesmoon, and this is Venus hour, Saturn day. And Venus is 24 degrees Sagittarius, applying to square Saturn. The moon is just leaving a conjoining with Mars in its sign of exaltation Capricorn in the 8th house, with Saturn in the 10th house, as per the time of this chart, and the midheaven close to Fomalhaut, which is a great time to contemplate the psychic wisdom of Fomalhaut and apply to the holistic meaning of finance. So here comes the video that here comes the video that they didn't want me to make, but was waiting all along for me to do that. And this is the holistic meaning of ritual finance, debt, and financial crisis as interrelated with that which is swiped under the rug, the dissociation and trauma and the thinning of the veil that aligns with Saturn Neptune, amongst other things. Um, where do we even start? So let's talk about playing with inflation, because playing with inflation allows two hands that basically hold and drop two sectors, two major sectors of the economy. Those who play to the debt or who play to the system, namely those who borrow a lot, usually not under their name but under the names of trusts, okay, and those who fund them basically, which is those who save money, okay. And this is what prompted me. The straw that broke the camel's back is the coin financials. Uh, okay, and this was a video that was coming to fruition, and that was kind of like the water breaks, and that video comes up because, and of course, the ascendant is last in between decans of Gemini, with Mercury in the 11th house of Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter. That's in 22 in the second house, okay? Um, squaring Chiron. So, also on the 22. So, basically, let's talk about what the coin financial explains. And this is basically how people that save money lose that money to inflation, which we know. And then the people that are running on debt will be required to return less in value upon inflation. Okay, what does it mean? For example, having a net worth, which sometimes means, and really shout out to Albina from Privileged View, which sometimes means you can't even go to the grocery store with your cash flow because it's reinvested, and and you basically take debt to put it in assets that are hopefully yielding, um, okay, or at least not losing, or at least balance out with what is yielding and with what is losing, okay. Um, so um, this is where those that are loaning, okay, they are being held by the tight hand that decides on basically the interest rates. Okay, if you talk about the subprime, and we try to bring it into the core, so the ones that say what interest level are the ones that decide if it's going inflation or deflation, and they play with the interest upon inflation or deflation. But before it summons to that point, there's a lot of money funneled in a lot of places most of which we don't see. And this is because the inflation kills, the hand on the inflation is the hand on the populi, and the hand on um, basically either the deflation, which people forget that exists, especially in real estate, because we've been told, you know, real estate never loses. That is very, very false. In fact, it hardly even sustains inflation. We're not told that because the only times we're told not to buy a house is when they're trying to sell it to the bigger sharks that are on the money line just as the populi. And this is where one card is deflation, which basically means they have to pay more in debt. And this card is a preview to collecting debt, which is Saturn Neptune. That's why the Soviet Union fell. Because what those who are living by loaning are constantly being told is that they could cash in on their assets whenever. Bogus. Try to cash in on, let's say you had a neighborhood in Maui, got lasered, okay? Force majeure or not force majeure, you will not be cashing in on the value you've been sold into. And let's say you were sold into mining rights. You'd get Mauied. Okay. So this is how the hand that decides the subprime, okay, the interest level plays with push. It's one of the main buttons that are pushed back and forth on the inflation and the lesser known deflation, because we've been told that it's always inflation, so that we'll take loans, so that we so-called do as the rich. Okay, rich dad, poor dad, but I forgot to mention the trust. And then we beg the question, so how do the rich actually get rich? I mean, think about the Gilded Age. There was a new money. Okay, how does that happen? Well, and here we go to a more intricate factor. And for that factor, um, I really want to credit Anya Weck, which is the niece of Epstein. But more importantly, she's the daughter of a man that does what Epstein did, but to 3 years old. and and she openly talks about it on TikTok because her family owns the media. um, Annika Lucas, which I always credit, that's kind of like needless to say, and everybody that came to interview on her podcast, um, and of course the people who helped to broadcast these things, which is Sean Atwood, um, Heretic, and Andrew Gold from Heretics, and those people really help spreading out really important information. And this is where we come to the nitty gritties. Within those lineage of wealth, whether new money, old money, gilded age, um, the tribal association or the familial association is kept by cult like extreme trauma extensively. And extreme trauma is not the way they treat just the expendable children, which is horrible, but the interchange of horrible treatment and good treatment. That being said, they're being told that it's for them to be strong, that it's initiation right, that it's a great honor to be, and indeed they, talk about meeting monarchies, the people that make the world run. And however, what's sitting within is that, and I'll begin with one ritual, which is at least in at least in Europe and in Israel, is very common, and it is a living child buried with a dead child. Many, many survivors have such memories. Um, and it was even seen in movies at times. And this is where it's the invocation of the fear of death and facing death prematurely. So it's not an initiation, right? Because it's done to children. And that's seething through, okay? That's seething through what's supposed to emulate a death and rebirth, which is not even supposed to emulate. It's supposed to invoke trauma under the guise of an association. So these dead children that are buried become metaphorical ghosts in between families, households. The death that is buried in the lawn upon each asset acquisition. Okay, somebody's being murdered and then the asset is acquired. It's a ritual, whether it's a sacrifice or as murdering the person that used to live there. And not only that, the lack of childhood permeates to the juxtaposition of adults and children, invoking the inner child within both with a shit ton of drugs, usually not even administered, not even volitional. Okay, um, all under the guise of fun and good times. And those seething ghosts, these convoluted, intricate relations that are indeed relations. It's people's families, it's people's support system. If they go to the psychologist, their job, and I say that from direct experience, is to keep a person within those convoluted circles. So, okay, that's the so-called therapy. Um, and it's not, and the therapist is not excluded to that circle. He is, okay, or they are, depending, male, female, um, they are a part of this dissociative um, cycle. And I also have witnessed that. Um, the and what's supposed to be the support system, the litigation, and how do you say, the consultation or juristic consultation is how to keep the scales odd and how to apply to the odd scales and make it look like they're not odd. Okay. Libra in that notion becomes the image, the beautiful picture of the veiled lady that holds the scales. And I actually saw a painting of a woman that, a mother that painted the even scales. And when I first saw it, it was natural and normal to me. Um, and the second time that I would see it, our son posted that, um, I would wonder if this is an act of revolution, because usually the scales are odd. And that wonder lingers in the air. Okay, okay, because and you can imagine how intricate and subtle the the language, the communication, the tonality, and yet the mind control that plays on something being vulgar or something being unelegant. Um, Bless you, without the person actually wanting that to be so. It's not for nothing if you take a look at Mr. Bean, even Rowan Atkinson says that he wouldn't like Mr. Bean. And yet the notion of the vulgar becomes almost psychedelic when we think about what's done in the rituals, what's done to children. So that seething psychic, psycho, sexual, psychological, megalithic mess holds a bubble, and that bubble shows itself in the hand on the subprime, like a DJ playing a tune and using the equalizer to make both the rich and the poor under their power, which is motivated by the buried alive and the innate. This ritual is, even when I'm the second frontier, that ritual, at least one time that I remember was in academia, was done by psychic, okay, and more than once on me to invoke a burst of life, but also it tries to make people fear death and also want to control death. Okay, it's basically an attempt to initiate without volition. Because it's the second frontier and I never consented. Um, then, and of course, those children obviously don't consent either, which means that all the oaths that they have um, are basically based on nothing. Because that would collapse the entire economy. And and as you can see, when the foundations of the economy is trauma that has a telos, the desire to dissociate, which confronts, and the desire to confront, which causes to escape to dissociation. And then they play the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Saturn and Neptune meet, and then it dissolves. And that's the entire collapse. Now we're told, oh, people make money in financial crisis. That's not the type of collapse that we're talking about here. Every once in a while, okay, if we take it back to the, and again, thanks to the historical financial historian, if we take it back to the lodges versus the church, the game between them was that the lodges were the bank of the church. Until, and that happened in several banking crises, and thanks also to the coin financials. Basically, until they come to collect the debt. Every once in a while, they do come to collect the debt. And this is Saturn Neptune. Not every Saturn Neptune meeting, but definitely this one on the world degree. And Saturn is ruling over Pluto, which is one of those times in history. And then what happens to bankers that loan to the monarchy and try to collect the debt from the monarchy? The last time something like that was seen, I think we saw the French Revolution. Now, try and cash in on an asset that's been exposed as Epstein Island, maybe haunted. Who would be, who would purchase when it's done globally to everyone? And if we understand the innate psychology that preserves the so-called loyalty, that preserves the image of wealth, because here is the thing, that wealth is done by energy harvesting, which is fictitious. And the more it progresses, the more it feeds off of the energy. Then what happens? There's no energy. Now, when the bubbly, cult like relations begin to simmer, something, it's almost like a volcanic eruption. It's something that people can't hold. Think about the tints in the air. The okay, it's something that people can't hold the masks anymore. And all the rituals that were done to let off steam are basically perpetuating that which causes the things to simmer. Okay? Now, Here is here's a different analogy to the simmering pot. When I worked with a northern Israeli Bedouin person that came to the south and wanted to be the teacher that doesn't beat the children, one of the analogies that I used, we made contract with the children and so on. He did everything. I was the mastermind behind. And he contacted me as an English teacher because he was teaching English. And so one of the analogies that I used was, hey, those are third grade students, 9 years old children. So we did gamification and did, you know, jumping on one foot to the board and back so that the energy is actually contained. And then he said, I make a contract with them that they would be silent, but it works for a couple of minutes and then they're speaking again. And I'm like, well, of course, it would be abnormal if they weren't. They're 9 years old kids. And so I made the analogy of the simmering pot, where one has to guard the pot so it wouldn't simmer too much, but not to completely let it unboil either, okay? To allow that energy to be in the air. Now, when it comes to healthy growth, that's a simmering pot that can be contained. And indeed, that teacher became the favorite English teacher, and this only brings more growth. So when somebody comes to, let's say, instill a policy that tries to paint the children as aggressive and put cameras here, cameras there, but no cameras when a child is missing, murder in the bedroom, tayrada. They just released the dove. It was an 18. It was, I think, since 2007. Um, quite a case. The person spent time in prison, not enough evidence, and then eventually was released from prison and was vindicated. Um, so that's the kind of Neptune stuff. Okay, like, and still there are people say it's him, it's not him. Um, yeah, but if somebody would want to do that to these Bedouin children, in the shift of that teacher, they would have a really hard time because we got the method that works without beating the children. And then he told me, you know what? I can make it a method and I can turn it into a school. I'm like, go ahead. And there, basically, that's one simmering pot that works. The other simmering pot is these rituals that are a simmering pot that can't be contained. And just like those children, it's bubbling. The crescendo of collapse is a life awakening within souls that were told that they were sold as souls and that they are free in the form of they're free to get away with everything as long as they do that everything that they're free to get away of and on a certain basis. And that everything is of course crime. Are they free to not do crime? As Annika Lucas said, she was shown she will have a beautiful house and a beautiful yacht and a beautiful, but she will have to kill. She can get away with murder, but she has to commit it, and quite often. And this is where the threshold of getting the populi into crime and then opening a door. So you can get away with that, but you're going to have to do that as a job. And you have a big house, a big yacht, and that, of course, is all filmed, which means that once they decide to even the odd scales, even the active evening the scales, or what they call colloquially justice, is basically uprooted because from the get go, just like the hand on the equalizer of the subprime, that was made to collapse not just within the people, but also in and amongst the elite. When the church would not pay its debt, it casts away those that are dependent on its paying its debt to wage war. And this is where we begin to see the persecution of the secret societies which the monarchies are a part of. Okay, people know about the 33 degree. I saw on Facebook a Dutch person sharing a picture of someone that had the 35 degree. I don't know what's that. They have to come up with a higher degree for and each degree necessitates certain things that they have to get away with. But they can't get away if they're not doing anything. And so one asks, so how do people make money in if this is the situation? Well, there are minor controlled unsimmering, which they try to do with Epstein, in which they rejuvenate. They Maui someplace, some other person decides to purchase, benevolently invest to rehabilitate the Palestine. Usually there's a shit ton of gas and oil in place. And um, and that's a rejuvenation act. Any attempt to really globalize causes division. The fact that everybody is mingled in extortion cults doesn't mean that they can control the simmering pot and decide which Epstein to expose or which Epstein to leak. The image that everything is under control is very convoluted because, as much as people try to maintain everything under control, it's not really so. The number of times that children rebel, even as adults, something leaks. Because what is required is to live a loveless life with assets that are not. How should I say that? Even the food is not really nourishing. Because either you have the nourished soil, because you just freshly um, lasered, which harms the soil. So, but let's say you have some stocks of food or something like that. The stress of existence harms the absorption of minerals. And the youthful skin that is maintained by all kinds of questionable practices, including energy harvesting, and the fact that these children were traumatized. So people look younger, people look like children when they're traumatized. And that is, okay, and that is really, there are two ways to look young. One is to live a loving life. The other one is that people got stuck in a certain developmental age, which is necessary for the extortion cults because they have to fill them with children. How would they do that? How would they get an old person, old enough to be extorted person, to be erotically attracted to a child? Now, because it's practiced in indigenous tribes as well, there's a lot of people that say, "What do you mean?" Because we have so normalized the children don't have childhood. The children are not even seen as non-erotic. And the religion becomes the rules that are violated in a supposed liberating rituals. But it's all filmed. And when people don't think that it's filmed, they make probably the biggest mistakes in their lives to assume that they're not on camera. Even when it comes to the astral frequencies, thoughts, dreams, how do we turn, how do you hear me broadcasting? Okay, when I move my voice, okay, that's my vocal cords, they're basically strings that create vibration with the breathing. And that vibration is basically translating into sound waves, but it's basically a thermal, okay, a thermal anomalies created by the shape of my mouth and tongue that are that have patterns that can be sensed by thermosensors and attune as sound waves. This is what we basically later call sound waves. The anomaly in thermal conditions can be translated into sound, sight, and that anomaly exists in the perceived and non-perceived. Here we're talking about velocities of air in friction. That's what it is. It emits sound when it crosses certain thresholds on the strings of our vocal cords, but also in our sensory perception. I know I talk about sound a bit differently than, but that will help me to explain to you that just as we can tune in to, and what is MK Ultra? Ultra, if you talk about waves and frequencies and range, what is ultraviolet? Ultra red, okay? It is basically the expanse of the sensory to that which we are not normally sensing, and can be done by technology that translates those frequencies, which is why I'm saying that our thoughts can be recorded like a movie, our emotions can be turned into music. You know, this little technology um, that is attaching to the leaves of a plant and make the plant make music. So all these wonderful things are wonderful when it's, mushrooms makes music that sounds like mushrooms. Uranus is in Taurus. Now, all of these things, every once in a while, come to collapse. There are minor collapses, and then there are the bigger ones. My prediction is we're heading to a bigger one. And this is why, as Pluto ingressed into Aquarius, I talked about these are the timelines where the secret societies were persecuted. In Britain, people are asked, I think, in the policing force, 444 as I speak, people are asked to um, prove that they're not linked to secret societies today in Britain, in the policing force, I believe. So, Saturn Neptune on a worldly scale can be. And why does that happen? It happens when there is an attempt to collect debt from the monarchy. Okay, that's basically the onset that sets the thing, and the output we see is persecution. But it begins with this seething of the rituals that paramounts to something that cannot be contained emotionally, psychologically, and so on, but also fiscally. Neptune rules both. The wealth that is basically an image of wealth. If I A big shout out to Albina, and she said, "What does that entail to be a wife of a businessman?" And she says, "A lot of the times the business fails, so one has to have a non-attachment to wealth, and not only that, many times everything that is earned is reinvested." So that requires living with low cash flow. Okay, it's not how do they call it? What is? I think I'm mixing the terms. What is cougar? Cougar is ladies that look for rich men. I've no, I don't. I don't know, or divorced women. I don't know. Okay, but basically that is this myth of the lady that supposedly lives off of her husband's wealth, and um, that's very notably a myth. um, Either she's being sold into an idea that is an image of something, but basically also the net worth itself is a myth because one can invest in assets, but when it's time to cash in, just like the stocks, there's way more malleability than there seemed to be. And the image of with Neptune, something can seem so real for a person that stays, I don't know, in a big mansion or is living the life, so to speak. They are, um, the experience is so real. And when this, when the rug is swiped under from, okay, and this is because it's all a myth. They'd get this big mansion if they kill so and so. Now, what if they get caught? Who decides if they get caught? Who decides what happens if they get caught? Extortion codes work in a very intricate way because they're competing each other. And that is the Neptunian aspect of wealth. And I said when Pluto ingressed into Aquarius, I was expecting the big banks to go boom. And when that didn't happen, I said, well, it looks like the wealth went from Pluto to Neptune. And indeed, when Neptune ingressed, there was the tariffs change. The big economy shaking like a ship. And upon the ingress for good, definitely now it's easy to say, well, and I'm the first one saying that the regional is collapsing into the global. Yes. However, as Abraham Lincoln, that wasn't an outsider to those what they call secret society, deep state, or whatnot, said and very wisely, you can fool only some of the people some of the time. And when Pluto ingressed to Aquarius, I said, this is when they try to fool all the people all the time. That's the meaning of collapsing the regional into the global. And like Abe Lincoln said, you can't fool all the people all the time. So trying to control the segments is going to be quite impossible when Saturn and Neptune meet on 0 degree, world degree Aries. That's the meaning of Neptune. Um, People are sold into now. Definitely, Neptune in Aries, and big shout out to the Coin Financial talking about um, the Gilded Age and the banking system, particularly given the example of the Bank of Amsterdam having two separate bookkeepings. And the red one was what would later become Dutch East India. Okay, going from zero usury bank, 100% reserve, all backed in gold, to basically on the low, nothing backed, nothing, and completely collapsing and closing the bank. So um, Neptune in Aries, which marks colonialism, and shout out to Lara Duncheva, who's the first astrologer I saw pinpointing Neptune in Aries as the expedition age or the colonialist age. Definitely venturing into new countries. I saw a booming. I began the series Astrological Considerations for Declarations of Independence because I saw Aries is going to be a booming of new countries. But definitely, it's also historically, as Lada says, the age of colonialism, and colonialism was the age of speculative investing, which was a bubble that later popped. And so, if we think about the entire Dutch East India, it was an image of an enterprise that offered to buy the debt of the government and supposedly reduce it. Until the English ships came by. Now, it wasn't presented itself as such. And like I said, without extortion calls, it's impossible to understand how does a zero usury bank gets to invest in a speculative new builded ships company that is going to loot the gold from the Spanish. I'm sorry, the silver, not even the gold. They take gold and bring silver. That's economy one on one. Lucrative business indeed. There were 45% to return alive for a man going on an expedition, and they made insurance for the ladies. This is the beginning of the life insurance in the first traded company. But how do you convince a zero usury bank to go bankrupt, basically, if not for extortion calls? If they don't have an image, if they don't have anything recorded of that bank person sleeping with a young child and having the costume of doing that questionable, it's impossible to get a banker to get another book, write loans that are not supposed to be hand in gold. In gold. Not in paper that says it has gold, in gold. Execrete gold from the reserves and leave the bank empty, but with a book that says it's full. Without children buried alive in real estate, without, there wouldn't be pedos. And without adult people sleeping with children on camera or in photo or to witnesses, there wouldn't be gold outside the bank. Harry asked, how did that gold get into the bank? I don't know, folks. I mean, now the coin financials can't say it. But the atmosphere is waiting for the people to commit some really serious crime and then opening a door. But then the show of litigation and even in the scales, the big justice show, or what we call the guillotine, okay, is another show because when the when the centaurians die, every century or so, then there is, a world war because people fight over who will inherit these resources, and they can change the face of the earth. This is what A-bombs do. Um, and so there is way more speculation in what seems controlled, and there is way more control in what seems like speculation. Okay, a Bank of Amsterdam investing speculate, and Bank of Amsterdam is one example. The entire Gilded Age was such speculative investments that looted federal reserves basically and bailed out countries with a profit line. and extortion called attached. So this is what happens when we bring together history of finances, okay, which every person can watch on YouTube, and testimonies of ritual abuse survivors, which anybody can watch on YouTube, and just make sense. The astrology here is not even, the astrology gives us a timetable, but we don't even need it, because the astrology is, it's not, again, I'm an astrologer. I wake up in the morning and I look at the chart. But what I'm saying is that when we can see the signs and we can interpret them, we understand why is the British police asking for police officers or for the policing forces to show that they're not connected to the secret society. What interest in the world have they got to do such a thing before the digital ID? Because somebody wanted to cash in on the debt of the monarchy. That somebody probably is the Templars, which is connected to the secret societies. And this is before even the oil and gas companies that we know modernly from the Gilded Age. But to understand the sign, we need to be watching channels like the historian, financial historian, the Coin Financials, Annika Lucas. Um, okay, Heretics, Sean Atwood, Anya Weck. That now, here's the thing: people ask, how come Annika Lucas was allowed to speak? What do you mean, how come? Just like there are people like me who are just trying to um, learn about what the challenges are when they try to become, financially responsible, think about their housing, think about their job, recover from traumas, and so on and so forth. And by the way, good astrology tip: if Aries is crossing, right now as Aries is in the end, decan of Aries, if Aries is crossing one of your personal planets, this means that you're personally affected by matters that affect the elite. Okay? Um, I didn't wake up today and decided to study the elite, which is kind of like, what? I didn't even know there's such a word. Elite to me was a chocolate factory that my grandmama worked at. It's if she wouldn't come to work, they wouldn't know how to prepare chocolate. And that was, she definitely had a position of power, but but not in the elite sense. um, that being said, that being said, um, other than people who just try to recover from something or learn about what affects things and so on, there are people that are trying to calculate their investments, and people who are survivors of ritual abuse. Name structure. And they name how things work. It's good to know that your 401k and life insurance and investments are all in mind controlled, inspired by Nazi occultism, from tech to oil and gas, cult like lineages